So in our last video we worked on the UVs. We got these laid out. Let's see, UV editor. So we worked on laying out all of the UVs so we could create the image maps. And now in this video we're going to work on actually painting the image maps. One of the things we need to do to sort of prep the model for painting is to make sure that there are no overlapping UVs. I've run into some issues with trying to paint textures in Maya and it crashing under certain scenarios. So what I did is I went and optimized, make sure that there are no tight overlapping UVs, like specifically in the mouth, creases and things like that. So then if you just spread them out a little bit, it'll help later when we go to actually paint the UV maps. One of the other things we need to be aware of is that right now it's a low poly model, and the texture painting tends to work better if we increase the resolution of the model a little bit. So what we can do is we'll do a subdivide on the mesh, which will give us more geometry to paint, and we can just save the textures from that to load them onto the lower poly model after we're done. One of the things I noticed was had some overlapping UVs in the center and things. If you need to, just as a quick way of cleaning the model up, you can select the shell for like the entire head and then take this optimize tool and brush it across polygons, and it should spread them out. It'll fix the overlapping issues. One of the things you have to be careful about is running it across, say like the mouth here where it opens it up. I'm not sure exactly why it's doing that. What I did is I went and freezed or pinned the inner line and then ran this across it to get them to spread out so that I'd have a little more pixel density around the lips. Let's see. Let's check and make sure that we're good in the corners here. So Q, just W. Yeah, spread that out. You can probably get away with some overlap. I think some of the issues that I was having with it crashing had more to do with this viewport renderer, this viewport 2.0. I'll show you how to fix that in case you run into issues trying to paint in a second. So, I have been looking at all of the documentation of people that were having errors with texture painting. I did read that it doesn't like overlapping UVs in some cases. So make sure that you're working with a pretty clean UV map without the overlapping UVs. The other thing I've done is I've gone and separated the objects into their own layers so we can turn them off and on and see how the when we paint, we can paint without having obstructed parts of the model. So I'm going to leave this reference on to work with in the background, and I'm going to hide the body. Actually, the one layer I don't have is for the head here, so let me make a layer. Layers, create layer from selected, and we'll call that head. Save that. So now we can turn the head off when we go to paint on the body. So the viewport 2.0 issues that I ran into had to do with all the different versions that you can have and the OpenGL versus DirectX 11 drawing options for this, and your graphics drivers as well. So it can get complicated, be hard to solve, but technically it should work. If it doesn't work, if you go to paint something and it crashes, there's a good chance that you probably need to adjust the way this viewport 2.0 section works. So if you go under Window, Settings and Preferences, and then just preferences. It'll open up your preferences window, and where you can get access to the Viewport 2.0 drawing options is under, let's see, settings? No. I believe it's under rendering. Nope. Let's see, display. At the bottom of display you see Viewport 2.0, and the options for rendering engine are varied. So you've got OpenGL Legacy. I believe mine was set for OpenGL Core Profile when I was crashing. So I just set it to DirectX 11 because I'm on Windows. On a Mac, OpenGL Legacy Core Profile Strict, one of these may work better. But since I'm on Windows and I have DirectX 11, I'll set it for that and then save it. What happens when you set that is you may need to restart the application. I already had mine set for DirectX 11, so it should work. And we'll save the scene. And if you had to change that setting, then restart Maya, because otherwise it won't take those settings. All right, so in order to start painting this guy, I've gone and created a Lambert shader for him. We'll go and make a new material just for his head, and we'll assign. So right-click on the object that has it selected, assign new material, select blend. You can do a Lambert if you want. The blend will just give you some more specular. And then under the modeling, instead of modeling tab, we'll go into rendering. And right next to the render button, there'll be a texturing option. If you select 3D Paint tool, and you have the tool settings up, which again you can get by clicking on this little hammer menu up here in the right. You're going to get access to all of the painting options for being able to paint a texture map. Now, you'll see if I run across this object, I'm getting an X, which means I can't paint anything, and that's because he doesn't have a texture to paint on, an image map. And the way you can set that up is if you assign down here under File Textures, assign Edit Textures, click on that, set it for 1024. Smaller, you may run into crashes if you try to set it larger. 1024 will be fine for painting a texture. If you ever need more detail, you may want to paint at 1024 and then go into Photoshop and touch it up. Use the 1024 as a guide, or you can just try painting it at 2048 or 4096 and see if it doesn't crash. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm going to paint it at 1024. The image format is usually set for the default Maya IFF, which should work okay, but I've gone and set it to PSD so that when I go to save these textures, I'll have the textures. I can access them in Photoshop and then go modify them. So set it for PSD, and then assign the texture. So now you see, after I've done that, I've gotten this painting circle that I can paint with. So I can go ahead and just start painting a texture on there. What I'm doing though is I'm painting color on transparent, because you can see I still have the blend in the background. So let me float erase that. I can make my life a little easier if I look at the base color of the object that I want to paint. In this case it's kind of a yellowish green, gray, brown sort of color. I can select that color in the color palette, find, or at least try to find a version that's close to it, something like that maybe. Let's do this. We'll go lighter because we're going to paint dark for his eyes and things like that. So we'll look at that, and then we'll flood paint. Whoops, sorry. Flood paint was set for this color, so let me do it. Actually, we can sample that color, sample the brightest spot of it in the window. And then flood plant, we'll go a little bit brighter than that, and maybe make it a little more colorful. Then we'll too colorful. All right, flood paint that. So now we have our start color for him. And it's good to go with a middle tone, because then we can paint highlights on the cheeks using wider colors or things like that. Or we can rely on the highlights coming from the actual specularity of the object. We'll play around with it. Maybe I'll go a little bit brighter. Yeah. So now when we go to paint the eyes, one of the other things you can do on this is you can control the scale of the brush size here using this, and it's based on a scale and a width. Usually you can just mess with the scale and leave it fine. There's no way to undo the stroke that I just did, so if I go and if I make a mistake, I can go and sample the base color again, or just go and flood with that color to fix it. So there's no erase brush. Well, there's this artisan erase. Let's see if that works. I'm not sure if it will, but if we say erase, so it's erasing to an actual image or an image object that's loaded up for artisan. So you can set this erase image. But for the purpose of just painting, we can go with this paint effects, paint, smear, and blur. Let's see. So one of the other things you can do is you can load textures. If you click on this little paint bucket tool here, it'll bring up the visor, and you can actually select different types of brushes. If you want to create your own brush, you can click on this, and this is the Paint Effects brush settings, which has a bunch of different options for how to create these types of effects. If you come up with a favorite brush or color, you can actually save it. So if we wanted to say, I want to be able to paint this, paint over this flood color that I filled here, I can select. So we've got these previous selections here, but I can use the icon and just select that, and then I can take and save this brush that I have set right now as a template, or I can create a new one. So let's see, hold on a sec. So I should be able to save this as a new brush. Bear with me. So probably under texturing. Nope. If I open this, I can add a favorite. Let's see. Nope. Should be able to save this as an option. Let me try this. So I have this setting. Okay, maybe it's here. File browser for shape profiles, so you can create shapes. Last image file for the shape of the actual stroke of the brush. Let's see. Set erase image, file texture. Let's try this. Stroke. Edit the template brush. So we can load a template. How do we save a template? Sign, edit textures, show wireframe. Last brush. So that'll go backwards in the list. Probably under here there's a place to save it. So we've got paint, global scale, channels, brush profile, twist, mesh, shading, texturing, illumination, glow, UUID. Node behavior. Well, you'll have to look up how to save it if you come up with a brush that you like. The goal was to have something that we could always paint back with in terms of the color. Alternatively, you should be able to save whatever your background color is as a space or a color chip in your palette, or you can go and sample it to paint back over. So what you can do, if you want to just paint like flat colors, you can go and modify just this brush, use paint, smear, and blur. Change your colors, change your opacity so that you're painting with different. So if I wanted to create some brightness in the cheeks, I can turn this to more white color, and then I can go and just paint with, that was the flood opacity. So what I can do with, I paint with a brush. So if I select one of these brushes, now I can go and sample this color. Oops, sorry. Sample this, make it brighter. And then if I go and paint across, so I'm painting with erase still, undo. Oops. Actually, I can paint over that with this. So now I'm painting with this brighter color. Let me fix that. So now I can paint sort of highlights. Now it's a really rough way to paint with a highlight, right? So I'm painting these like really sharp edges. I could do a softer brush to paint this outline. You notice you get these weird dots. That's probably just in the drawing. Or super fine, and you see I get more dots right here in terms of the way the pattern's set to draw. What I can do is to fix that is if I select blur, I get a different brush, different profile, and I can just run across, and then suddenly I start to get this nice blend of color to play with. So this is how you'll go about. Think of it like applying makeup on your face. You make a kind of a long streak stroke, and then you end up kind of blending it all together. So speaking of blending, I can take a smear brush, just set it down here on Paint Effects for smear, and I can drag from one to the other, and it'll start to blend that way too. This is a nice way to create high lines or wrinkles across the face and get the kind of blur going or blend going that you want, or even create like swirly paint effects, kind of like what I'm doing right now with that. And if you don't like what you do, you can just go back and blur it again, or you can fill with your flood paint, which we'll go back and get from here. All right, now when I flooded it, I filled it with based on opacity. So if I set it all the way, if you watch what's going on here, it should flood everything and get me back to my original. Okay, so one of the other things you can do is, if you can, like I said, you can load these artisan brushes or these brushes. So there's like this sort of red. If we just select this red kind of airbrush stroke, then it gives me that brush as an option. I can do a blur. It's a default blur brush, so I've given them some sort of like rosy cheeks. An eraser, but that's why is it eraser? I guess the eraser is going back to whatever my last saved brush was. Nope, it's painting across. Setting a color. It's not even doing an erase. I'm not even sure. Oh, maybe that's creating like an eraser, like the kind of pink you get on an eraser brush. There's a default paint, which is a nice black, and you can change the color. Gives you a nice brush shape. There's this push brush, which allows you to just shift everything really tight. So we can use that to kind of like wipe out an effect and then blur out whatever's left. Anyway, I got rid of it that way. There's a medium airbrush, which gives you a nice soft dark. Then you get this smears, which lets you do some kind of cool smearing of paint, sort of like treating it like oil. And then you actually have, there's a smear color swirl that kind of adds color to it and does a smear at the same time in sort of a particle pattern. The smear small, which just is again another smear but a little bit less detailed. There's a whiten for brightening, just to bring things sort of an overlay whiten, because you can also do overlay effects. So you can set this and then down under, where is it? Paint. That might be under artisan, but when you're painting, you can actually set it to, let's see, attribute to paint, assign textures, reload files. I've seen this. It might be under artisan. Yeah, so the artisan is you can paint the blend mode, and you can basically set it to lighten, darken. So darken would be nice for creating, because you need to be actually painting in darken. Set the opacity. So then when you darken, it's just going to slowly take the color and do a darken over the top of it. Darken or multiply might even be better, because multiply will actually blend with the color that you've already got under it, so it's just going to blend that and apply it that way, which is nice. It's a nice effect, so you could use that to create like darker lips or shading, kind of a ambient occlusion style shading. So that's just the typical brush strokes for airbrush. You can also paint actual paint effects. So if I select this snake brown, I can actually paint like scales across his face. Or snake green, snake tube. And you might want this just to get at some kind of organic colors, or if you were actually painting a snake, you might do it. You could also create these brushes and paint effects and then use that for your actual texture painting. Same with this city mesh. I'm not sure if mesh brushes actually paint. Yep, they do. But what they're actually doing is just taking the texture from the mesh brush and painting across. Let me go ahead and flood paint fill. Whoops, I set that for... that's weird. Was it set for artisan? And if I set it to default, flood paint, yeah. So flood paint actually takes on the nature of the last brush that you use, which could be handy because you could use that as a way of kind of creating an overall darkened tone. Alright, so then you could paint clouds. You can create some nice skin tone or marbling, different kinds of clouds. Electrical, and these are sort of like particle brushes. So if you take this and you run it across, you notice how when I drag, it actually draws electric streaks, and you can see where it hits the edge of the texture map and cuts across. So it's sort of, that's one thing about these texture seams, is that it becomes hard to paint across. I'll show you how we can sort of fix that later. Then there's these feathers that are nice. Again, follows the seam, but when you go and you drag across, then you kind of can start to cover up the seam. It still shows up a little bit, but we can do blending and smearing to fix that. Then you have these like cloth fibers, which draw sort of like cotton daubs or sweater type material. Fire, I won't draw that. And this flesh color, there's a finger. So it can be useful for starting to get like a fleshy tone shade if we wanted to paint them. And then we can blur the colors out. You see where it's got this sort of line stroke tube sort of look to it though, so that gets tricky to add, but it is a good way to get like a general flesh tone, and then you could come later and blur, or say something like this. You could come later and blur out these hard lines to create more of a flesh tone. I'll show you what that would look like. Hold on. Let's go this way. Yeah, something like that. Okay. So he's kind of a mess now. He's got this weird looking face. Let's go this way too. Now, if we wanted to fix that, we can just take and set it for, let's try blur. Now you'll notice the blur intensity, if I go with blur 8, is like a really blurry intensity. It can work good. If I want less, it'll take more strokes to blend it out. So depends on what you're kind of going for. So as bad as this was, let's try 4. Yeah, 4 will work pretty good to keep some of the tone and then blend out these hard edges. So you start to get a nice looking varied flesh tone. Maybe 8 was good for these. It's not too bad. There's probably better ways to do this. We could have hand painted this. There's methods, if you look up like Hollywood effects masters, they'll have like processes that they go through for creating flesh tones on rubber mask and things that they use for actual Hollywood props. And generally what it boils down to when they're doing that, if we wanted to do a flesh tone, is we'd get a base flesh tone, which we kind of have here. We could sample this brush color. So let's say we want our base flesh tone to be that. We'll actually fill it. Let's do that. Fill, flood paint. So now we have a base flesh tone. And what happens is you get different layers of fat and blood vessels and bone, different colors. So you know where there's veins, there's lots of blood flow. It's going to get a little bit of a blue tint to it. So you could select this blue kind of tone, turn down the blue tone and turn down the opacity. Also, you could click on this paint effect setting and then come up with a, let's see, texturing. Let's try flow animation. So there's flow speed, texture flow, stroke time. Let's see. Trying to figure out how to create some daubing type effect. Actually, what we could do is if we look at, because I know the oil brushes, the oil painting brush has it. So let's see what it looks like. Modify color, modify alpha, brush width, stamp density, twist, and multi-streaks. Nope. Tube sections, 6 subsegments. Here's the shading. Map. And map opacity. There's a ton of settings here you can see. So if I do something like that, and let's just change our color to, let's go back towards the yellowish color because we want them to be kind of washed out. You'll see as I paint, it's got this stroke, this oil paint stroke to it, right? Which creates a nice painted look, which can be useful. One other thing to notice is that if I want to turn on reflection, I can actually paint across the entire object and reflect it. You see how the stroke mirrored across. Now, something to consider though is that that doesn't work great, and it actually slows down your refresh a little bit. It doesn't work great when you get to something that paints across a UV seam that jumps across the map. So if I do, let's say I want to paint this underside, see where the seams show up on the brush? If I paint this, you see how I got, all of a sudden it jumped this streak where it tried to find the edge of the UV map and ended up hitting somewhere around the neck at the bottom of and that was because of the UVs, the way we made the UVs. So what I think is most of the time it's just better to paint without reflection, because you're going to end up with a lot of this depending on the way you've UV mapped, and it just refreshes better. You get a much more real-time kind of refresh across the entire model, and you won't run into, like, so if I go and I paint this, you won't run into as much issues trying to paint across seams as you do when you've got it on reflect mode. Reflect mode, for whatever reason, tends to do this automatic jump when it hits the edge of a UV seam. So you've got these different types of brushes that create kind of a particle, and you just have to go and study the actual brush using this option, this brush settings option, to try to figure out what's doing that. But you can get a lot of nice effects. Oh, this is a smear, so it's going and doing a smear on, which is hard to see because we've already got a lot of detail. There's a nice brush stroke. Blue. You can see it's just sort of this particle type system. Here's a tubey stroke. Super colored. So then you have some paper options where we can create like a paper texture. You know, some of this stuff is like you're not going to want to do it for like something like this particular model, but there may be a time when you need a quick kind of dot pattern like that, say on a hut or something, or a basket, and you'll just want to do this across it and it'll work pretty good. Pastels, there's lots of art brushes, so pastels are just like pastels, they build up and layer over time, which can be really useful as a starting point for creating this whole. Pastels could be a good way of, say, starting with a flood paint of a skin tone. Take one of these pastel brushes, and like I said, there's a blue tone that you're going to want to use around anywhere where there's going to be lots of blood vessels, so that's going to be around the eyes, like this. It's going to look messy for a sec, but you'll see where I'm going once I do this build up on it. So the idea is you get these areas drawn out. There's going to be blue around the lips. You're like, yeah, but lips are pink. But yeah, if you look at them, there's actually a blue undertone to them. And not the ear. There's going to be a kind of yellowish tone to the anywhere that there's going to be bone showing through, or there's going to be fat. So it'll be like here, across the forehead, maybe across the tops of the eyebrows, the cheeks, because of the fatness, the ears with cartilage, back of the ear. And what you're trying to do here is sort of say, well, what does the face look like under the skin? Skin is actually transparent, and because of that, you get a colorization to different parts of the face based on what's actually under the skin itself. And that's going to be blood vessels, fat, bone, different types of blood. So, veins would be blue, arteries would be red. Let's see, try this. Now we want to, at some point we want to start to play with how this stuff layers, because we're going to want to vary it. There's going to be times when there's going to be a little bit of both. So we're going to take and sort of go with this pink or red and vary the transparency a little bit. So there'll be a little red there, some blood here, across the forehead and the ears. You're going to get where I'm going with this in a second. This is only if you're painting, a flesh tone person. But the thought is the same. If you were doing like a blue-skinned alien, what color is their blood? What color is the fat? And paint across. Do this kind of layered technique across that. Before you actually start to paint the skin tones on top. And I'm going to show you what that looks like in a sec. So he's going to have a lot of red around his nose, and then maybe some more purplish under the eye and around. You see how it starts to build up and blend to create more warmth or less or coolness depending on what's going on actually under the skin. So let's see here. I'm just kind of blending it all together with the pinks and reds. Muscle, that's the other thing. So if the layer's skin, like it would be across the cheek where it stretches, you might actually see more muscle through the skin that way, or at least the color from the muscle. Alright, I'm just going to give this one last little pass. So now we've kind of got our, let's call this our base under the skin mapping of what's going on in the face. What we can do is run, just set it for a smear, make it a big brush, like that, and we'll set the smear, not spear, sorry, blur, big brush, and we'll set the level of blur down to, let's make it 1. Just to kind of help get rid of some of this texture. Not that we needed to do that. You might actually want the texture. You might even want to create like some blood vessel type brushes that streak and create some blood vessels, or you might even just paint some blood vessels under it. Alright, so that's our mapping. So now we want to try to start painting skin over the top of it. And the skin itself will have colors. Usually skin's white, but in this case we're going to paint a little bit of skin transparency. So we'll go with our base skin color. Let's give it, a little more lightness because we're going to make it sort of transparent, something like that. And we'll set it for paint. Do that again. So now we're going to go super transparent on the opacity. Make our brush pretty big. And start to airbrush over this until we get a tone that we like. So you start to see where you're kind of getting the skin over the top, but also what would be under the skin showing through in terms of coloring. And this is actually the way rubber mask or fake heads or any kind of like horror props in Hollywood get created. They actually paint this in order to create more realism. And based on everything I've ever done in ZBrush, it works really well once you end up getting it. Seems like a lot of work, but once you end up getting the technique down and understanding what you're going for, you can end up getting some nice realistic looking results as far as skin tone goes. And it takes a little practice, just like anything else, but maybe I'm a little too... Yeah, it's better. I mean, obviously the brushes I was using for creating these general colors under the skin were very much more paint stroke looking, but they kind of work. You can see I'm laying it on. It's almost like imagine you're in a robot factory and you're trying to cover the metal parts with this blow-on skin. Like, I think I've seen some movies where they do this. It's sort of like this rubbery compound that they're just like spray painting on top of the metal parts, and somehow it ends up solidifying and forming something that looks like a rubber skin. It's the same process. You're mimicking that same concept here, where we're slowly covering up the under parts, the muscle, the fat, and the blood vessels that would be part of the head. And the same thing for the body. So, you know, you can go and look at like anatomy models of, you know, the human body without skin and get an idea for what colors would be where in terms of fat, blood vessels, muscle showing through. You'll get that idea, and then you can come back and you'll understand where to paint these undercolors. And then you'll just drop skin on top of it. You don't have to be picky about the skin part. You can just paint it everywhere because it's gonna. But you'll do it in varying layers of opacity so that you'll get more or less stuff showing through from the bottom. I'm gonna crank up the opacity quite a bit here and start to paint over the. So one of the things we can do is we can start to change or vary the skin tone a little bit, a little more. See, starting to look better. You know, I'm not too worried about painting details on the top of the skull here because he's not bald, he's got his hair. But yeah, this is looking good. So you see where it starts to take on. And if you try to paint this in reverse, if you try to paint these colors on top of the skin, it could work, but it doesn't seem to work as well. By painting them this way, you end up getting that kind of underlayer. The idea that there is some sort of tone or color that's showing through this transparent layer of skin on top. So So now this looks nothing like the model that we were going from, which was very stylized, and the actual movie that he came from was black and white. So he's gonna, he's gonna have a different type of look. But if you took it and painted it this way, you could always go and render and turn on a black and white effect. So that way you have a model that works for a lot of different occasions. So if we actually decided, well, yeah, we don't want him to look so gray or knocked out or black and white, then we can actually use, paint him for flesh tone and then render him for, render the actual overall scene black and white later, or even just modify his material. So you get the idea. So we have this flesh tone. Now he's just sort of an overall flesh tone. We might want to pink up the cheeks. Let's make that more pink and take down the transparency a little bit. He's going to be more white cast. Let's make his nose red. Take the brush size down. Yeah, give him like a reddish nose. He's got a cold. And the same thing for his lips. Now if we wanted to really paint his lips right, we probably would end up going and using the sculpting tools and opening his mouth so we could get access to the end. There's a seam right here where his lips come in. But I'll show you a way of kind of working around that, at least to get the outline of the lip, because it should be a little more. It's too blurry the way I'm painting it right now. You can see where that hard line is right there. But as you get into his mouth, it's going to go more red anyway. You can see where I can't quite get to certain parts of the inner mouth because his mouth is closed. All we have to do to fix that is if we went and used the sculpting tools to, or if we had, we don't want to paint this texture after he's rigged, but if we open his mouth and to get access to the inner mouth and start painting there, then we can. So, and we might paint some more red up around here. Some more red on the inner eye because there's a lot of blood vessels there. And this is the basic process for if you wanted to paint. I know it's a lot of work, and you can always just go and do a flat flesh tone if you want, but at some point somebody's going to want something a little more realistic out of you, or say you kind of shorted them on the quality of the texture map, and you're going to have to go about doing something like this. So I'm showing you how to do it right, and it doesn't take that long. The results are looking a lot better. Sorry for the barking dog. Okay. Give him some cheeks. And paint the tops of his ears red. One of the things I didn't do, because it's actually working out okay, is I could have gone and done a subdivide across this guy to give him a lot more polygons, but it's actually working out okay doing it this way. So I thought it might be necessary at first, but using these soft brushes tends to work out okay. So now once we've gotten all this red, we can go back in and do another layer of skin tone across to soften it up. So we may want to do a little more blue too, particularly around the eyes, just to kind of create the sunken look. Maybe around the nostrils. Let's see, blue, and then maybe a little around the lips. And we'll go back with their skin tone. More of a normal skin tone though. And take the transparency down. So this is obviously a way to paint a more healthy looking Igor. Didn't want to show you, you know, if he was so white, you don't really get the idea for the technique to do a healthy person. So I'm painting him sort of healthy, and we can come back and flood fill him with colors that'll make him look a little less healthy. We want to make him jaundiced or something like that. We'll do kind of a yellowish tone fill. Let's see. It's not too bad. He's got nice dark eyes. His lips are pinkish. Not as red as they should be, but they're a start. Alright, so that's, gives you the idea. So now what if we want to make him look this jaundiced dark look? Let's take and we will flood fill it with something more yellow, white. Yeah, looks good. Take the opacity down, and we're going to flood paint. Gives him that greenish yellow look. Then we might take and using that same color but brightening it up a good bit, go and create some highlights and dark spots. So we want them to be so highlights across the cheek. What color am I doing here? I'm filling it. Oh, I'm doing the artisan paint, which is using other things in the brush. Can't go back. It's going to erase. Let's do it this way. There. That's one of the things to be aware of is when you go to do, the only way you can get this opacity is if you are set for an artisan brush, but then you also have a lot of other options that could be doing things like modifying the brush in some way that you may not want to do. So what you can do to fix that is find the brush that does what you want. So like this past white pastel, then we could take, select, make it brighter. It's too bright. When I'm on paint, there's my artisan. What is going on? It's like it's using some brush. Very strange. Well, one quick way to fix that is with the airbrush and the smear. blend it out. Sort of works. Alright, so let's say if I want to darken up his eyelids, I want to give him some dark, baggy eyes. We can select this soft shadow brush and soft shadow is set for paint effects. See how it's got this nice soft dark edge, but the brush itself is too big, so let's make it smaller. Not that small. 2. And we can start to give him some baggy eyes or darken it. It's a bit strong, but like I said, we can blend it out later. So, just get a dark outline on his eyes. And we can take and blur it. Looks pretty good. A little dark, but we'll see what it looks like with his eyes turned on here in a sec. Close that. Go to channels, eyelids, and eyes, teeth, and hair. It's not too bad. Looks kind of sickly, which is what we're going for. Crank up the blur intensity a little. So you can see where all those colors that we did before are starting to come through. To create some variation in his skin tone. That's pretty good. Yeah. Let's go ahead and paint his nostrils. Now, gonna have to go pretty small to fill these in. And I'm probably set for blur. Yeah, paint. Okay, color's right. It's got a nice fill softness here. Looks pretty good. And then we can do his eyebrows. You might want something a little less, so we can go sharper on this. I'm going to show you a little trick. Take the brush size to 0.1. You can paint this way, it's solid, but you can see how pixelated it is. You could always just fill these in Photoshop too, but turn his hair off. The idea is to sort of just get, and if you go beyond the edge, it's okay. I'll show you why in a sec, because you can always smear it back to the edge. The smear brush works really good for cleaning up these pixelated edges. So you don't have to be super careful. But you do want this eyebrow to be, at least based on the way he's modeled, the version that we're working from, to be to the edge. Kind of went really big there, but like I said, you don't have to be that careful. Okay, and just to show that you don't need to be that careful, we're going to go bigger. Go 2. And just paint across the whole thing. Okay, so that's really, really rough, but with the smear, if I just go down here and turn on smear, notice it's really big. Let me crank it down to a smaller size. Like 1. Then you can take and just start brushing, just drag towards the eyebrow. In fact, let's make it 1 and 1, just to make it sharper. So you can clean up the edge that way, and then you can drag across. It all kind of blurs. You might even like come back in with another brush, but the thing is, like, pixel density wise, the reason we get these edges is because there's not a lot of UV map associated to his eyebrows. We could fix that. We could cut the eyebrows out if we really wanted to get a sharp edge. We could cut the eyebrows out and make them bigger than the actual skin here, and just paint solid across the skin, and then just paint the eyebrows dark, and because it'd be separate UV island, it'd probably clean up and be pretty solid. In fact, I might show you that in a second. You see how it's started to get cleaned up here. Wish there was a line tool. The other thing is you could always straighten this out in Photoshop. Do a selection and a click. Line tool for that to get it to clean up better. Make a solid, more solid line. Because in the end you're really just talking about straight edge polygons. Might be more difficult to do it on a organic, less or higher poly model, but because we're working low poly on this guy, it should be doable. Another way you can do this and really get it clean is if we select these faces. Surrounding the edges. Extra there, something like that. And then go back and paint, and you notice how we've got these islands to paint in now. I can, it's only going to affect that area. So with smear on, then if I just pull down, I can get it really tight. It's not going to bring it across the eyebrow. you see where, I mean, it does bring it across a little bit, but only to the edge. One way to fix that is if we had done a subdivide on the model or a smooth modifier on it to create more polygon detail, then there'd be a lot less of this going on along the edge anyway, because there's just going to be more polys. It's because we're doing a 1024 by 1024 texture. But this is, you know, probably good enough for a low poly model, because like most of the time we're going to be looking at this sky, we're going to be that far away. You don't really see those aliasing edges. Alright. It's a nice way of creating like a mask to work with, especially on low poly models. Alright. So there's texture map for his face for now. Could add a lot more, but that serves the point of showing you guys how to do the texture mapping. You know, we might, if we want to just paint this, let's go ahead and do these eyelids for now. Select those, select this again. Okay, now those don't have texture maps. They're using the same texture map as, actually they do, because if I take these and assign, because of the way we did the UV map, if I assign this material to those, so assign existing material, blend 1, they take the texture that's already been assigned, then I can paint them, and I can just flood fill those. So I got to be careful with the flood fill, because I don't want to flood fill everything that I've already painted, and it's because it's using the same texture. If I do a flood fill on this brush, it's going to paint over all the things that I've painted. So what I can do is I can select these and then convert, or go into modeling, UV, and just take these faces that I'm interested in for now, select those, use the brush, and now I've got a flood selection. You don't see it because it's the entire object, but if I do a flood paint, here, let me do a flood paint using something, actually I'm doing a smear too, so flood paint of, let's go with a darker eyelid, so flood, wait, do I have to, because they're separate objects, I may have to apply a separate texture to them, because it's saying I don't have texture assigned, or maybe I didn't use the right material. Let's take a look at the attribute editor. It's using blend 1. It's got a color assignment. There's no file assigned. You can see the texture that's already been painted here, but so let me go to File, Image Name. This will be 3D Paint Textures, probably whatever the name of this folder is, Igor Final UV Toot, and it would be not an IFF, head shape, color 1 I'm guessing. Nope, different one. Head shape, color. I've done this a couple of times, so maybe I'm in the wrong folder. Final UV Toot, I haven't saved it. Oh, I didn't save the texture. Let me go back, undo. I may have lost all that work that I just did. Let's see. Go here. Because I didn't save it here. It was all undone. Alright, lesson learned for you guys. Let's see, reload file texture. No. Sun and edit texture. Probably that. Did I not have it selected? Hold on a sec. Select. Object. Sun and edit texture. There's that. Flood fill. Bear with me a sec. Load up a brush. Oh, sorry. Is that for a flood paint? Nope. Igor head shape. So it was in Igor head shape 2.1. PSE doesn't exist. Maya 3D paint. Oh, it's in a temp folder. So we might be able to get it back. Let's try this. Material. Blend 1. Somewhere there is a link to, and it's not in our default. I'm guessing it's in the documents. Maya 2016 2.5. Where was that? Let's look at our menu and see where it complains. So it's users calling app data, local temp. Users calling app data. So, Colin. Let's see my local. Users local. What was it again? Users calling app data local. This, I don't see app data. So I may have to, it might be that it's actually go to see users calling. Somewhere in there, there should be an app data. But I don't see it. Let's try that again. See users. Show hidden files. There's app data. Local. Whoops, went up one too far. And then, oh geez, a lot of temps. Let's see, what was it saying? It was local temp, Maya Paint 3668. Hopefully it's still there, we'll find out. Local. Temp. Slowly. Maya, okay, we're looking somewhere. Maya 3D Paint 3666. clean these out. My paint, this one. Aha. Let's try this one. Nothing. Or this one. There we go. Wow, that was worth it. So I didn't lose it. I just lost reference to it. But it's good to know. So I'm guessing these are the new texture. We may have to combine them after. And that's going to be... Actually, maybe I can paint them now. Let's see. Let's do a new texture for them and see what happens. Just thinking about it. Now I can paint, so now we can flood. Yep. So what we can do is we can take this and sample to something like that. Flood. Let's go darker. Yeah. Alright, so back to where we were. What we can do is select the actual UVs that we want to, for the internal. Just select those. Yeah, they're selected in our window now. Go back to the paint, and we get our selection. And I can go flood them with a, nope. Maybe the flood doesn't follow. But if I paint, yeah, so painting will. For some reason flood, oh wait, yeah, instead of flood all, flood selected faces. Then I can flood paint. And I get my outlines. And that's all I have to do then for that. I mean, I can do more. I could go and paint some reflective effect on the eyes, but that's good enough for now. Alright, that's probably a good enough place to stop. You'll have to do the same thing for the body, you know, paint his shirt, create a texture for that. But you get the general idea of how to go about texture painting now. And in the next, once I get this paint done, the next video we'll go and do bone binding, rigging, and mesh weight painting to get them so we can have them animated. And that's that. Save this as Igor Final UV Paint. Okay. See you next time.